Alright, hello you guys, welcome back to my channel. We are doing yet again another Teaching in Your 20s podcast episode. I'm so excited. This episode is all about classroom management. This has been such a struggle for me all 3 years of teaching, and so I'm excited to talk about it, just share my struggles, share my own tips, things I've tried, things that work, things that don't work, and just go from there. But I hope that you guys enjoy. Make sure that you are following the podcast on all of the platforms, which I will put up here and also in the description. And if you have not listened to the podcast before, thank you so much for being here. Welcome to this teacher community that we're building, and I am so excited that you are listening. And also make sure to get caught up on all the episodes that you missed. So let's go ahead and just get straight into this episode. Hello, you guys, and welcome back to the Teaching in Your 20s podcast. I am your host, Christina Himmelho, and in today's episode, we are jumping into classroom management tips, really geared towards first-year teachers. This is something that I have struggled with all 3 years of teaching, and it honestly made me a little bit hesitant to even put out this podcast episode because I do not feel like an expert at all, but I definitely do know a little bit. I've done and gone through a lot of the trial and error, and although it's still an area of my teaching that I am really working on, and I think I will be working on for a long time, it is something that I feel like I still want to talk about on the podcast, and it is a requested episode. This is something that you guys wanted me to talk about. What are my classroom management tips, especially when dealing with students who are displaying defiance? I think that is definitely the biggest thing that comes to mind when I think about what I have struggled with classroom management. It's not necessarily coming up with the routines or even implementing the routines. It's what do you do when a student stares you in the face when you ask them to do something and they just blatantly say no. I feel like this is not something that we practiced in college, and although we did have our internships, it's not something that I experienced that much, and I also feel like the homeroom teacher or my mentor teacher would handle the situation if a student was saying no to me, and I didn't realize how much I needed to pay attention to how she was handling the situation until I came face to face with several students who just say no, and you're like, well, this is what we are doing right now. And so that is what I want this podcast episode to be about. I also feel like my voice today is sounding a little bit weird. I don't know what happened. I haven't been talking that much, but just bear with me. And I hope that you guys are able to get something from this podcast episode, whether it is just that you are like, oh my gosh, finally someone talking to me about things that I can relate to, and I do not feel alone in my struggles anymore, or if it's that one of the tips that I say really resonates with you. I would love to know about it, and make sure to leave a comment either on the video if you're watching on YouTube or in the Spotify app. You can also rate the podcast, and also be sure to share this podcast episode with another teacher that you know is struggling with classroom management and just needs some tips or just needs to hear from someone who has been there and to feel less alone. That is a big reason why I started this podcast, is because I don't want new teachers to feel alone in the struggles that I faced. I didn't have a podcast like this to listen to when I was a first-year teacher, and so that is why I've created this space for us to just talk about the struggle and figure out how we can make it just a little bit more manageable. The biggest things that I want to talk about, and I think the questions that I've seen the most, are how do I handle defiance calmly? How do I de-escalate a situation? And how do I know when to involve admin or ask for help? I think those are some of the common things that we look at as teachers when we are trying to improve our classroom management, and of course talking about the basics like routines and procedures, and also how to be strict and still feel like you are yourself. And if you are starting off and you're like the young fun teacher, keeping that persona and not feeling like you need to turn into a teacher that you are not. If you're not feeling like being a super strict teacher in the sense of the kids come in the classroom and are not having fun, there is no need for you to become that. You can still have a classroom that runs very smoothly and be the fun, energetic teacher that you have always wanted to be or that you have dreamed of being. Starting off, I want to talk about the defiance piece. I found this to be something that I experienced a lot my first year teaching, especially with kindergarten. And honestly, it was the biggest surprise for me because I think a lot of us that go into teaching, we obviously were like the really good students. We had so much fun at school. We would never dream of telling our teacher no. And we probably just, at least for me, I don't really remember any kids in my class being super defiant. I'm sure it happened, but I just don't remember it. And obviously, as somebody who wants to be a teacher, you are remembering your years in elementary school and all the arts and crafts and all of the fun things and your own behavior in the classroom. I think a lot of us who have decided to go into teaching were good students in the sense, I'm putting it in quotes, which you can't see on the podcast, obviously, unless you're watching the video version. But I put it in quotes because I want to be very careful when I say like a good student. I'm just talking about the fact that we like obeyed the rules. That doesn't necessarily make us better or anything like that. That's definitely not the message that I'm trying to get across. But I do know that there are also the other spectrum of people who teachers really impacted their lives and maybe they weren't the quote unquote good student and that made them want to get into education. But either way, when you are a first year teacher and you are put in a position where a student is straight up telling you no, you may be wondering, what am I supposed to say at this point? Because it is so hard to develop all of that teacher talk and to develop the right de-escalation strategies. And so I want to talk about things that worked for me in my experience as a first year kindergarten teacher. So I'm going to talk a little bit about very specific kindergarten teacher things that I feel like will also apply to just kindergarten all the way to like second grade. And then when I was a fourth grade teacher, I want to talk about those things as well because I handled situations very differently when I was a fourth grade teacher as opposed to when I was a kindergarten teacher. As a kindergarten teacher, I really tried to employ a lot of de-escalation strategies. And I'm sure you have heard of these because that is something that we learned in our behavior management course in college. Now, the thing that I did not realize is how many times I would need to repeat these strategies in order for them to start to work. So when I say that, I'm going to give a very quick example. So let's say you have a student who is refusing to participate in the lesson. They do not want to do any of their work. Maybe they even threw the crayon on the floor or they're crumpling up their piece of paper. And so two of the biggest things I would say, number one, you have to remain so calm. Honestly, pretend like nothing has happened because you do not want to show that you're angry or even get angry at all because it will just escalate the situation. The angrier you get, the angrier the kid is going to get. The softer you talk and the calmer you are, the easier it is for that student to be as calm and as quiet as you are. I would recommend you go up to this student, and I've said this before, we do not want to be saying this out loud to the entire class. It also just interrupts the lesson when you do that. But just proximity control, get close to this student and just remind them of options. And the options that you are going to give this student, this goes along with the de-escalation strategy and goes along with what I'm saying about how you will have to repeat it several times. And so one of those things could be that you're offering flexible seating, or you are offering them to use a crayon instead of a pencil, or you're offering them to work with a partner or work by themselves. And it is something that in the end, it is in your control, and you are giving them controlled options basically, with the end goal being that they are still completing the task. So the student says, I'm not doing this right now, or they are demonstrating with body language that they do not want to do it right now. And you very calmly, quietly say to them, would you like to do this on the carpet or do you want to do this at your table? And then if they're like, I'm not doing it. And I'm like, oh, well, do you want to do it at the carpet or do you want to do it at the table? Like, you repeat those options. And if they're still not, then maybe bring in a different option and say, oh, do you want to do this by yourself or do you want me to help you right now? And so you're giving controlled, limited options that are still giving you the result that you want, where the student is doing the task and you are not escalating the situation. That is the whole point of the de-escalation strategy, is to bring down the tone, bring down the energy, and give them options where they still in the end have to do the work. I think a big thing with kindergarten, if you are a kindergarten teacher, is that you have to remember that a lot of the times these students have not been in school yet before. And so being forced to do something is very new to them, especially if at home they can kind of do whatever they want. And now they're in an environment where they have to share. They're not the center of attention, and they have to do things that maybe they don't want to do. So that usually worked for me. I would say 90% of the time that worked for me. And definitely remaining calm is probably the hardest thing to do as the teacher, because it can really get under your skin and you can feel very overstimulated, because you also might have another student who really needs help at that time, or you might have several students who are displaying the same behavior, and you just have to keep working on it and work one-on-one with the students, and it just can be a lot to manage at a time. But my biggest tip is to stay quieter than that student. And I even would do this with the whole group as well. This is one of my classroom management strategies, I would say, is instead of raising my voice, I would just get quieter, and then the class would get quieter, and they reciprocated that behavior. And so that is definitely a big tip that I have. And also in kindergarten, I did experience a lot of student meltdowns. When I experienced a student meltdown, I think it really depends on where you are. And this kind of is leaning into the discussion about when do I get admin's help and when do I just figure out the situation on my own. I think a couple of things that you can do if a student just decides to throw a temper tantrum. Something that I've experienced is like randomly we're like walking in the hallway going to our special area, and then I have a kid just like sit down and start like scream crying and throw their shoes off. And in that moment you're like, what just happened? I have no idea what just happened. And in a situation like that, when you're not in your classroom and it is just you walking in the hallway with a bunch of your students, I would definitely at that point call for help. Or I think in this situation, another teacher saw me struggling and she brought my kids to special area while I stayed with my student who was having a meltdown. But if it is getting completely in the way of student learning, or it is becoming unsafe in the classroom, that is definitely when you are going to be wanting to ask admin for help. And I feel like this is pretty obvious, but as a first year teacher, you might be wanting to try to handle all the situations on your own, and you might not want to ask for help, or you might even feel embarrassed, like, oh my gosh, this is a reflection of my own teaching. And I am here to tell you that it is not. There are so many things that these students go through outside of school, and you have not caused them to have an outburst or to have a meltdown. There are definitely things that trigger the students and can be precursors for the behaviors that you see in class, but do not be hard on yourself. And it is so much better to ask for help than struggle on your own. And so, especially at the beginning of the year, this can be the trickiest time for classroom management, and also the most important time to be setting those routines and procedures. So this really nicely leads me into talking super quickly about routines and procedures. So I did do a routines and procedures will save you a whole entire podcast episode on this while I was a first year teacher, and I am here to tell you that that episode still stands and you should go listen to it, because routines and procedures are the most important thing to make sure that your classroom is running smoothly. Every single thing that students do, from grabbing materials to turning in work to how they interact with their partners, when you're telling them to turn and talk to their partner, you cannot just tell them, oh, turn and talk to your partner. It has to be structured, and they have to practice, and they have to learn how to communicate with one another. Every single little step has to be taught and practiced over and over again at the beginning of the year in order for you to get to a point where you feel like your classroom is running smoothly and you do not need to be giving those reminders over and over again. And especially, I really want to talk about those turn and talk moments, those group discussion moments, because those are the moments when I found my first year that I was surprised at how in depth I had to explain to students how to talk to their partners. And something that was really, really helpful for me was giving them sentence starters. And so having a structure to your group discussions, or even having each student numbered when they work on group projects and they all have a different role, those things make such a big difference in how your classroom is going to run, because then there's no room for time for students to be doing things that are not part of a routine or a procedure. So I really highly recommend, if you are a first year teacher, to look into adding some of those super structured group discussions, super structured partner discussions, and even during independent work, how the students are checking on their work and making sure to hold students accountable for the quality and the work that they are turning in. And so instead of just having students do an assignment and say, okay, now work on this independently, it can be so much more helpful and beneficial to have some sort of self-reflection with the activity, have some sort of checklist that they need to check off. And I implemented this with my fourth graders as well as my kindergartners. They all had a little paper that had like their routine for their independent work, and they had to check off whenever they finished an assignment. And you have to be very strict about this at first, because some students will just like say that they did it and they did not really do it and put a check on it. And so you have to make sure that you structure in time to be checking their work. And so something that I did with my fourth graders is they had their independent work for the week, and at the beginning of the day while they were eating their breakfast, I would go around and check and make sure that the activities were actually completed, and I would make them like show me their work on their computer, and I would make them show me what they had done. And if they had not, it usually would just be a message that I would send to the parent, and I would say, hey, like I went to check their work and they haven't been doing their work during the day in class. I just wanted to let you know. And if I needed to end up having a phone call with the parent, then that's what I would do. And for kindergarten, I would say instead of going straight to telling the parents, I would do some sort of more fun reward system. And it could be like a little external reward where on Fridays you're checking that they've done all their work for the week and they can get a sticker, and then all their stickers could lead to getting to pick something from the treasure box or something. And you could even do that for fourth grade too. But really holding students accountable is a really big piece of classroom management that I feel like I did not realize until I taught fourth grade and until the end of my third year teaching, how important that is, especially for students to be motivated to do their work and get their work done and know that, hey, my teacher is going to be checking all of this and I cannot just slack off and not do my work during independent time, because obviously you are with a small group of students during that time. And so independent time can be one of the hardest times to manage. And so I think having a system with that where they have accountability for what they're doing, and especially with fourth graders, holding them accountable for their progress in class is so important and can really help with your classroom management in the end. And so little things like them knowing their scores on their tests, them knowing how many more points they need in order to succeed for their standardized tests, and making sure that they just know where they need to be is so helpful for them to stay motivated and to want to do well. If they have no idea how they're doing in class, it can be hard for them to even want to put in that effort to try to do better. All of those little things are really, really crucial for classroom management. Another thing that I have mentioned on the podcast before, but if you are a new listener, I do want to mention now, is making sure that you are staying strict even with the students that you trust a lot. Because once you give a little bit of leeway to one student, all of the other students are going to notice and they're going to want the same thing, and then you're going to be exhausted. And so just stick to the routines and procedures that you set at the beginning of the year and do not stray away from them. I think if you want to have a classroom job that's the teacher helper, that's where you could be like, okay, go get these copies for me, go do that for me. But then it's still a structured routine where it's like, okay, once it's your classroom job to be the teacher helper, then you can do that. And it makes more sense for the student and it's not inconsistent. Students thrive on the consistency, on things feeling fair to them. And obviously they have to learn that things are not fair all the time, but just for your sanity, keeping things consistent and fair is really going to help you in your classroom management. The next thing that I want to say is that I think because there are so many different ways to manage the classroom that are like all those cutesy little things, do not get overwhelmed with that and do not feel like you have to make your classroom management extreme and above and beyond and make everything a cute theme. It does not need to be that way. Honestly, your first year, the simpler, the better. Stick to things that you know work. And once you have your routines and procedures in place, then you can start trying to add in some of those more fun things if you have time for it. I never want any first year teachers to feel so overwhelmed by the amount of different strategies that there are out there and like that Pinterest board type classroom. Really just do what works for you. Make sure that you have some fun rewards in there for the students. And also, this reminds me that you do not need to sacrifice your time as a student reward for your students. So when I say that, I know that some teachers like to have lunch with their students, or that's really the one that I can think of that takes away your time. As a first year teacher, this might not be the best reward for students, just because you might really need that time to decompress and relax and breathe. And it's really only 20 minutes, 25 minutes that you have as a teacher for your lunch break anyways. And so filling that with a student reward, you don't need to. I have never done that in any year of teaching, and I don't think it made me a worse teacher for it. And so I just wanted to throw that out there because I just thought that that was a very common reward system in the classroom. And I personally never have done it. And I just want to say it's okay if you don't do it. If you do it, I think that's incredible. I think it's great. But I just could not, for my sanity, be having lunch with my students as well, especially individually. I think I had lunch with like the class like once towards the end of the year, like all of us, but really I needed to protect my peace and quiet and just eat my lunch on my own. I really think that classroom management is a struggle that all teachers face, and sometimes it depends year to year how difficult of a time that you're going to have depending on the behaviors that you are seeing in your classroom. I want to make sure to normalize this because every single year that I have had teaching, I have gone through struggles with classroom management, and really it honestly has come down to like a few students that I struggle with. It never really got to a point where I felt like my whole entire class was chaotic. I think it was just that there were certain students that stood out that I was struggling with, and I internalized that as having not the best classroom management. But really when I looked at it, it was like, okay, there are a few outliers, and there always are going to be outliers, and honestly those are the students that need you the most, because they tend to be the students that are going through the most in their lives outside of the classroom. And so just keeping in mind and honestly remembering on those days that you are struggling that one student's behavior is not going to ruin your day, it's not going to make you a bad teacher, it is a learning opportunity, can really help you with your mindset and just feeling better about your classroom management as a whole. Another tip that I want to talk about that definitely changed my mindset about the way that I spoke to students, and just when there was a situation where several students were talking over me. I know there is the classic teacher saying of "I'll wait." And I ended up flipping this to, I would give my students like 10 minutes of free time at the end of class, and it was dependent on them finishing all their work, and they loved playing games on the computer. And so this was really a lifesaver and just made my actual teaching time so much more productive, to the point where I could take those 10 minutes at the end of the day. But let's say I had students talking over me, instead of saying "I'll wait," I would start a timer on the board, and the students would know that that was taking away time from their extra free time at the end of class. And honestly, it worked really well. I implemented that for a little bit. And I do think that sometimes, especially with callbacks, I loved using callbacks. With my kindergarten students, I loved using callbacks, and I would switch them up for like every season. And when I taught fourth grade, I noticed I wasn't switching it up as much. And honestly, the kids got bored of the callbacks. And so towards the end of the year, I started pulling in like more of those fun callbacks that related to my students and that they liked. And sometimes I would even let them make up the callbacks that we were going to use. And that really helped to getting their attention focused back on the lesson again. And I really do think that the pacing of your lesson, the energy that you bring, and making sure students are moving around the classroom really helps with classroom management. And I found that this is why I loved teaching social studies when I taught fourth grade, because we were always moving around, we were doing group activities. And then when it came to our reading curriculum, it was honestly boring, and I had a hard time figuring out how to get students excited about what we were learning, and I think that impacted my classroom management in the sense of the kids weren't really excited, and I even was like, I know that this is kind of boring, and that definitely took a toll on how engaged my students were in the lessons. And so I think that making sure that every single lesson you have the kids moving around, even if it's just something that I saw other teachers do in 4th and 5th grade when I was observing, is instead of just asking the questions to the students, they would have them go to other sides of the room. So it was an opinion question. If you think this character, blah, 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 go to the right side of the room. If you think this character, blah, 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 go to the left side of the room. And it was just a super quick way to get the students up and moving and not sitting in their desks just bored. And so I really, really think that having active movement in your classroom, taking those brain breaks when you notice that your students need them, will really help you in the long run. Along with student behavior comes communicating that to the parents. And I just did a whole episode about parent communication, so make sure you go listen to that. But the biggest thing that I want to say about communicating student behavior to parents, just super quick in this episode as well, is that I always found that it was easier to call a parent and have that quick conversation than to send messages back and forth. And I always documented everything. I said this in the last episode as well, but just make sure you're doing those things when you are sharing any information about student behavior to the parents. And the parents are going to be your biggest supporters, and sometimes you're going to have parents that are harder to connect with, but in the end you both want the same for the student, which is for them to succeed. And so having a good relationship with the parents is super, super important and really ties into your classroom management. That really sums up and closes out what I wanted to talk about in regards to classroom management in this episode. If you guys have more specific questions about certain situations that you're struggling with and you just want to know, hey, what would you do in this situation? Feel free to send me a DM on the Teaching in Your 20s podcast Instagram, because I'm always open to having conversations on there. And I know that classroom management is such a big topic, which is why I just wanted to do a super quick episode on the general tips that I have. But if you guys want to hear more specifics, like let's say on those routines and procedures, let's say you want to hear more about the defiance and how I did that in different situations, I would love to do podcast episodes about that. Just let me know what you guys want to hear. I hope that you have been able to take something positive from this podcast episode that will help you to feel more confident in your classroom management. And maybe there's something that you want to try out, or something that you really heard that was an aha moment where you were like, oh my gosh, yes, I need to try this in my classroom. Make sure to let me know in the comments. And I hope that you have enjoyed this episode. If you were new here, I am so happy that you are here. And like I said, I'm just so excited about growing this community of like-minded teachers and us just supporting each other through the hard days of teaching, as there always are. But I will talk to you guys in next week's episode of the Teaching in Your 20s podcast. And I hope you are having a wonderful week with your students and just a wonderful year overall.